Hola, bienvenidos a Fuego, el podcast con Ricardo Torres, la voz de la investigación de incendios en América Latina. Yo soy su host y hoy nos acompaña desde Knoxville, Tennessee, la doctora Elayne Pope, antropóloga forense y referente internacional en el estudio de restos humanos incinerados. En este episodio, la doctora Pope nos compartirá su trayectoria y cómo se convirtió en una de las máximas autoridades en este campo. Fuego no solo es un podcast, es un punto de encuentro para investigadores, peritos y profesionales del mercado asegurador. Fuego, donde el análisis es profundo, las conversaciones son reales y el conocimiento cruza fronteras. Antes de pasar a la entrevista, los invito a suscribirse a este podcast en su plataforma favorita: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music y YouTube. Asegúrense de activar las notificaciones para no perderse ningún episodio. Ahora sí, vámonos recio.
Okay, great. Elayne Pope, how are you?
Doing great. I hope you're doing well.
Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. We really appreciate you. And you know, I we've heard a lot from you on different podcasts. So you're certainly one of the probably one of the most sought after instructors. I know you've been really busy with traveling and doing training all over the US. It's great, fantastic. How are you feeling? How are things going?
Going good. I'm preparing for a lecture next week out in Colorado. And so I'm excited to see that part of the country. So yeah, things are good. Thank you.
Well, you certainly don't need an introduction. Everybody, I believe, that's in the service, whether they're law enforcement or fire, has heard you, has probably seen you, and if there's anything out there about burning bodies, you're probably one of the most recognized voices for that. So, um, just give us a quick recap of how you got into the forensic anthropology part of this, and when you actually started burning bodies and how that started.
Yeah, so I'm a forensic anthropologist by training. So I look at bones of the body and how soft tissues decompose, including thermal decomposition of tissues, and what is left behind after the fire in terms of burned bones, because they survive even after the soft tissues have been consumed. And so I started burning human cadavers back in 2001. Kind of dates me, but that's kind of when I got started looking at how different body parts burn in fires as they're exposed to heat, all the heat related changes that occur to the tissues as well as to the bones. And then started working with vehicles and structures, placing cadavers in those different fire environments to see how they responded, how they burned, and what types of evidence were left over for investigators after the fire for them to find at the fire scene.
Yeah. So with all that, I can guarantee you there is no question that you are an expert and probably the expert for these types of fires. Um, so let's talk a little bit about you and I worked with a good friend of ours who has passed, Dr. Quinteri. Uh, and if you recall, we brought you in after uh, him and I and another four individuals were part of a group of experts that were uh, contracted to look at the 43 students from Ayotzinapa. And although because of the NDA that I signed, I can't talk specifically about what was in that information that we looked at. But there is a lot of reports out there that are public, and I can speak to that. And so, um, first, one of the things you just mentioned right now that I'm really interested in hearing about, you talked about burning bodies in different situations or different types of scenarios. So that brings the point of testing. And testing has always been one of those gray areas where people say, well, I tested this hypothesis, right? And so you're like, okay, well, how did we test that? And so I want you to give me your opinion about. I'm sure you've seen that Dr. Jose Torero, who is a very well known, very well respected, and highly qualified expert, and I believe he did a test with using pigs to try to show the amount of wood that it would take to burn one pig. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so a lot of forensic testing uses pigs as a proxy for the human body because it is difficult to get a hold of human cadavers. But a pig burns very differently than what we see with the human body. Their skin is twice as thick. The pigs that they use are the approximate size of the human torso. So they're several months old. They're not a fat hog that has a lot of body fat. They're also bred for very dense, lean muscle or meat, which burns very differently than what we see with the human body that has skin, fat, muscle, but a lot of subcutaneous fat. And that's kind of one of the contributing factors in this case is the human body fat in terms of how it becomes a fuel. Basically, when you heat up fat, it turns to grease, and so that becomes a fuel source in the fire. Um, and so, burning human cadavers, we see that there's a huge difference between the tissues of the body, how they burn, versus a pig body, which burns entirely differently. It's apples and oranges in terms of how they burn during the fire, how long it takes to burn each body, and the final results that are left over. So, different tissue types, different durations, huge differences between humans and pigs. And so, like I said, they're used a lot to model forensic work and forensic cases, but it's not reliable and it doesn't translate very well, particularly when conducting experiments of trying to replicate a burned body. So there are problems with using pigs as a proxy for a human body.
Okay, so if uh, if there's a big difference, right? What else can be done then in order to um, properly test a hypothesis on the amount of fuel it takes to burn a human body?
Yes. So, in addition to testing how the body burns in vehicles and structures, I've also done a lot of burns, experimental burns outdoors, using common combustible materials of wood, tires, ignitable liquids, and whatnot. Again, to see how the body burns and what's left after the process for investigators to find in terms of burnt soft tissues as well as burned bones and teeth.
So now going specifically to the you said in open field, right? The the I remember when Dr. Quinteri first started to look at this particular case. I know he did a test. I believe he did it at his home, where he burned a rabbit, and
Yes.
he he set up a little pyre where he took a rabbit, put a little clothing on him, and then proceeded to burn the body. And he said that what he learned from that experiment was that the combustion wasn't very good until the body of the rabbit fell into the pyre, and then it pretty much basically consumed the body, and he said there was nothing but bone fractures left. So how do we correlate that with a human body in an actual field test?
Well, in terms of using animal models, in this case, a rabbit, In addition to testing how that body had burned, he was also looking at construction of the pyre, different changes of the pyre as fuels were consumed, movement and descent of the body into the pyre, as well as kind of other variables that he was looking at, in addition to consumption of the soft tissues, uh, cremating the bones. But also, like I said, he was testing the effects of the pyre, the construction of the pyre, the amount of fuels, and then how the pyre burned in relation to the body and what was left. So it was a good bench test to explore the area.
Yeah. So I remember when I first saw the test that Dr. Torero conducted. I believe it was in Australia, where he took looks like 8x8 uh, pieces of wood, and he stacked them up. Obviously, he was trying to get to a certain amount of weight or mass, and I believe 700 kilograms is what he was aiming for to use to try to burn this one pig. Because that's what his findings were, that it would take at least a minimum of 700 kilograms of wood to burn one body. And then he extrapolated that to 30,100 kilograms of wood to burn 43 bodies. And that was like, wow, that's a pretty impossible number, right, to get to. So what's your take on that?
Well, for one, the construction of the pyre, like you said, he used 8x8 um, pieces of timber. They were also stacked and arranged really tightly, which would be very different if you're using branches, parts of the trees, or whatever wood. Um, the amount of wood is an incredible amount. I was able to do an experiment of a body burned on a pyre and only used about 150 kilograms of wood, and mostly that was wood pallets that were where the body was stacked on top. And one thing he did not consider is refueling, adding wood, which is going to break up the body into smaller pieces, which burn much more effectively than a whole intact body. So he tested the variables of how a pig body burns and on a pyre, but the pyre was unrealistic, and then using a pig body is unrealistic as well, just because they don't have body fat. They don't have very much body fat when they're young animals. So very different than what we see with the human body that has a lot of body fat. Even in young adults, you're still going to have body fat in the torso and the thighs, which again becomes a fuel source. It renders into grease. And in this case here, the grease would have become absorbed into the timbers, into whatever wood is being used, which is going to sustain the fire. You don't even have to add accelerants to keep it going. Basically, the body's fat is gonna fuel that fire. So his model was very different, and excessive amounts of wood as well as time. Um, with the experiment that I did, I was able to cremate a body down to burned bones, which would be considered ashes, but pieces of burned bones in a little over 2 hours. Like I said, using about 150 kilograms of wood, just mostly wood pallets and other pieces of wood. So my time in my experiments was considerably less and involved considerably less fuels in terms of wood. So our results were extremely different in terms of showing how a body can be cremated, just using nearby materials, either at the dump, whether they were there at the time or imported or whatever, but basically just using routine fuels. It was able to demonstrate that it could be done in terms of burning a body down to burned bones and fragments of burned bones and teeth in a much shorter duration.
And you bring up a very good point when you're talking about the timber that was used, because I'm from Texas. We use wood all the time for our barbecue. So, we take mesquite trees, we cut them up into pieces, and then we pile them up, and they'll burn for a long time. I mean, they're great for barbecue. So, but that's totally different from trying to burn, like you said, a piece of 4x4 or 8x8 timber. It's gonna take a lot, and if you're not actually feeding that fire, it's hard to sustain. So I totally get where you're coming from when you're talking about the difference. And one of the things that I really admired about when I first met and talked to you was the fact that you actually do field testing. And so uh, I think that speaks a lot about you understanding the need to recreate the event as close as possible to the actual event that occurred. And in this particular case, and this is published in the reports that were put out by their experts, that a pyre was built using rocks, and that the bodies were stacked on top of each other, and that they used wood and tires within that pyre. So you can imagine now there's bodies stacked up with all these different combustible materials. I believe they used gasoline or diesel to start the fire. And so they stoked this fire throughout the night, and it ends up being that they had this fire burning for about, I don't think it was more than 16 hours. I think it was somewhere around there is what they ended up indicating that the fire took. But when I look at the report by Torero that he put out back in, I believe this was in 2015, he stated that 43 bodies would take 60 hours to burn. And I kind of, figured, well, wait a minute, I mean, I've burned, um, being from Texas, we do a lot of bonfires, right? So what happens when you got a bonfire? The first initial big burning of that bonfire is pretty impressive, right? We got a lot of heat release. There you can feel the heat from several hundred feet away. Um, so when we first started looking into this, I honestly I thought, well, one of the things that we're not, or that he may not have taken into consideration, is that those 43 bodies actually became part of the fuel in that fire. So it's everything burns, right? So
Yes.
this the we're not just talking about the bodies being burnt in an isolation. They're part of the full fuel load that was uh, being burned at that time. What can you say, or what do you um, believe should be done in order to uh, be a little bit more accurate? I know it's hard. We talked about burning multiple bodies, right? We talked about
Yes.
that one time, and how difficult it would be, because you can't let the remains from one body to mix with another. It's just
Right. Right.
impossible. So um, how else could we go about this to kind of get a better idea as to what numbers, or what actually are the correct numbers for 43 bodies burning in an open field?
Right. So that's right now, it's mostly kind of hypothetical just because I've only done single bodies at a time. Um, it is difficult to get a hold of human cadavers, also very expensive, and there's a lot of logistics involved. So it's not like I can go out this afternoon and conduct an experiment. Um, but basically, ideally, it would be a good idea, if possible, to be able to burn, say, for example, 4 or 5 bodies at the same time. But again, there's the problem of commingling, because the cadavers are returned back to the families, and they need to be
Hmm.
returned back. Each body needs to go back to their family intact and whole, not mixed with other individuals. So that's kind of problematic there. But I mean, I would love to be able to do multiple bodies specifically for this case. I mean, it's a huge human rights case, and a very tragic one as well. And so I would love to be able to accurately reproduce it, even if it's not on the scale of 43 bodies. But we look at the body in terms of fuel load, but then we also got to look at the pyre in terms of how it's going to collapse, how those bodies are going to move. So during burning, the muscles shrink up, and basically it'll cause the arms and legs to flex. So the body's moving all throughout the fire. And then you also have collapse of debris. You have collapse of the branches. Once they become charred, they're thermally weakened. They can no longer support the weight of the body. So the bodies can fall inside the pyre. They can fall outside the pyre. And then you have the additional variable of refueling. If you're throwing heavy fuels onto the body, it's going to break apart those different body parts. And so there's a lot of things that could be tested, even if we don't use actual human models. The easiest one to do would be to actually use young piglets, and include a little bit of fat in the experiment. But that would be similar to Dr. Quinteri's experiment, kind of a tabletop test, just to see the dynamics between burning of the tissues as well as dynamics of the pyre, how that changes, how that affects the body smoldering in the ashes. That's going to continue burning soft tissues. It's going to continue burning bones, even though those are mineralized and they'll survive. So there's a lot of things that would result from a single experiment of using multiple bodies. But as of now, I haven't been able to reproduce it using multiple bodies, which obviously is problematic because we want to be as close as possible to the actual case. But like I said, I've only been able to demonstrate it on individual bodies, of which I've burned multiple ones in outdoor scenes, either on pyres or as roadside dumps where all the debris is piled on top, and the body remains protected. So how the body is in relation to the pyre being elevated, getting, flames rolling all around underneath and above, as well as the body fat dripping into the wood, that's going to be, a unique circumstance that's going to really contribute to how these victims may have burned and become cremated in mass during this fire event.
Right. So there's another point that you and I also talked about at some point, DNA testing. If you recall, there was a couple of bone fragments that they were able to recover DNA test or data that they were able to tie it back to at least two individuals that are three individuals that are missing. So
yes,
they have a I don't know what the number of bone fragments that they have that the Mexican government has. Is there anything that they can do with those bone fragments to try to get DNA?
yes. So the technology back in 2014 was pretty bad in terms of DNA testing. Now, more recently, there's the DNA tests are much more sensitive and can be much more conclusive in testing the bones. There's a current technology called rapid DNA, which was first used on a mass disaster scale in 2018 during there was a wildfire that wiped out the town of Paradise in California. And bodies burned and smoldered for days. And a lot of them became reduced down to charred and calcined bone fragments. And they were able to identify those individuals and accurately identify who they were. Now, in terms of the bones that were collected in Mexico, a lot of them in terms of the photographs I've been able to look at from the Argentinian forensic anthropology team, a lot of those bone fragments were darker in color. So as the bone burns, it goes from kind of a greasy yellow color, and then we get charred black, which is the pyrolysis of the burning of the carbon of the organic tissues, which means there's still DNA. And then the last stage is calcination. And that's where most of the organic tissues have burned away. And it's a lot more challenging to get DNA from those bones. But the bones, a lot of the bones that were recovered were darker, meaning that there's potential DNA. Now, the reason why they have a lot of the darker bones, or the likely reason why they have a lot of the darker bones, is because they would have become camouflaged in the charred wood and in the debris. Whereas the white calcined bones, those are more recognizable. So it's easier to pick them up and to transport them, or do whatever they did with them, transport them, to the river or whatever. It's easier to identify and pick those white calcined bones out. Whereas the darker, the black charred bones, the ones that were recovered likely, were camouflaged in the debris, and they were overlooked. They probably thought they had everything when in fact they were leaving behind evidence. And, it's possible those same bones could be tested with the rapid DNA, and to see if there's any more genetic material that could be utilized from those cremains.
Right, and this is such an important case. It's such a huge case that I think everything should be done that can be done to
Yes.
test, first of all, and try to see if they can identify those bone fragments and if they belong to any of the other students, number one. And number two, definitely don't leave any stones unturned. In that there are, I know that I've read recently all these articles, and there's been a lot of this continues to be in the news, whether the military was involved or not involved, whether the local police had anything to do with this. And I remember I originally, and all of us, have always said, it is not our interest to get into the politics of that part of the investigation, because there are so many different things that are hard to prove or disprove. But burning bodies, that to me is something that if we actually do some testing, and good testing, we may be able to at least come back with a hypothesis about whether you can burn one or any amount of human bodies using normal combustible material. And I think that's something that
Yes.
you and I share.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. Because I mean, these victims were sons and uncles and nephews. I mean, these victims have families, and the families need closure, and they haven't gotten that. And I think that's the biggest tragedy of all. Of course, in addition to the tragic deaths, but it has far-reaching implications to the community, friends, family, and whatnot. And I agree with you. I think no stone should go unturned, especially with newer DNA technology, especially with testing human remains instead of pigs on large 8x8 stacked wood pyre. Um, there's more that can be done. Even if there are limitations to it, there's still more that can be done to provide answers to these families. And instead of telling them, give up hope, the bodies aren't there, keep searching for your loved one. Over 10 years later. I mean, that's
Yeah,
horrible. That's absolutely, I can't imagine.
right. So, um, just pivoting a little bit now, because I think we've done a good amount. We've spent a good amount of time on this particular case. what other cases do you normally look at, or do you assist? I know that a lot of law enforcement and fire agencies um, go to you, and I know you can't talk specifics, but what kind of cases are you looking at now that you're helping out with in that field?
Sure. So I've had a few kind of similar cases where bodies have been burned outdoors or in burn barrels. Burn barrels are really common, where the during the fire's refueled and stoked and stirred, and the body is crushed into small pieces. The body parts can be scattered on other parts of the property, in which case you're finding very small little tiny pieces of bone, which can still be identified as human. You can differentiate human versus animal bone. So if there's a question about that, burn barrels, that's another kind of type of situation where the body is refueled, pulverized into small pieces, which would be considered ashes. But basically, it's just small pulverized pieces of calcined bone, which charred and calcined bone, which potentially can still yield DNA. In which case, sometimes they're identified through those methods. But other cases I do are ones where they don't exactly know the time, the duration of the fire, or why the person died, or how long it takes to burn a body in relation to other fuels or other materials that aren't burned at all, where you have an excessively burned body. So I look at traumatic injury from gunshot wounds, stabbings, beatings, and whatnot, because a lot of times they'll leave signatures in the bone that survived the fire, and can be reconstructed to, kind of help identify how that person died or why they died before being burned.
Yeah. So um, I know that a lot of your training that you do is specifically geared to for the law enforcement community and also fire. I've seen that you're doing a lot of training programs where you're teaching the fire and the law enforcement. How many
Yes.
more training events do you have scheduled for this year? Because I know you're busy year round, right?
Yes, yes. Well, it dies off in the winter. So I've got a few more trips coming up before winter settles in which case then there's really no training. But I'm working with a group out of Fresno, California. It's the Central California Forensic Fire Death Investigation Academy. And we had our course last year in April, where we burned 10 human cadavers in structures and vehicles. And then the students go to the field and they do a scene investigation as well as recover the burned human remains. They learn the proper techniques of how to document a scene, how to handle evidence, how to package evidence, and the types of information that can be gleaned from an extensively disfigured, distorted, or cremated body, in terms of what that can be used for in their future investigations. So I do like lectures. I also do training. Like I've got one coming up in Massachusetts where we're going to burn pigs. So pigs are good for training, but they're not good for making direct correlations between a human and an animal body. So occasionally there are, live burn demonstrations where we'll use pig bodies. But I've also lectured for this past year. I lectured for the Alabama Coroners Group Association, and we burned 2 human bodies in vehicles, which was really interesting. One of the cadavers was approximately 400 pounds. The other cadaver was a little over 200 pounds. And we burned them in very similar vehicles. And the 400-pound cadaver we burned for 45 minutes. So she had a lot of body fat. And then the other individual, we burned him for about 15 minutes. So differences in duration, but the final effect was very similar. Once you burn all the fat off, you get down to the musculoskeletal layer, and both bodies look very similar. You couldn't tell that the 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 original starting weight was 400 pounds of that individual, because basically all the fat had burned away. So sometimes I'm lucky in getting to do live burn trainings with human cadavers, but a lot of times it's with pigs. But it's still showing the basic foundations of how to document a scene, how to photograph, how to map, how to process evidence, how to package evidence, and whatnot. So it's still hands on, which is how I learn best. And I know a lot of investigators really engage in hands on training, which I think is the best personally.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, I the few fires that I was able to look at where we had fatality fires in South Texas when I worked for the state fire marshal's office and also for several of the other agencies that I worked for as a fire investigator. Yeah, we always were very cautious about the bodies, especially when we encountered a body inside of a burned building or a burned house. Um, when I never, well, I did once a body in a vehicle, but for the most part, everything was in buildings or houses, and so um, being able to find the evidence of whether the fire caused the death or if they were uh, dead prior to the fire. That's another. I remember one particular one where it was uh, a fire and suicide, and so finding the evidence to support that those findings was obviously a task of it in of itself. So I imagine all the training you're doing now is probably um, very, very helpful for those in the fire service or in law enforcement. Do you also work with a lot of the like with the coroners or people that work in the coroner's office?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually worked in the medical examiner's office for 6 years up in Norfolk, Virginia. So I got to see lots of burned bodies come through the morgue, as well as assist with the autopsies, and all sorts of different settings. I mean, we had intentionally burned bodies to cover up crimes or destroy evidence of the crime or of the victim. And then we also had routine, structure fires, vehicle fires, and whatnot. But the goal of my research is to accurately replicate these different types of scenarios. So that way, investigators know exactly what they're looking for, exactly what to expect, exactly how to process the evidence and preserve the evidence. Because a lot of times, evidence is overlooked or damaged or destroyed. The torso is going to be, or it is, the largest portion of the body. It's got the most mass, it's got organs, it's got the most body fat and whatnot. So it's going to survive a lot longer than the arms and legs, which are smaller body parts. So in doing recoveries hastily, a lot of times the arms and legs may be stepped on and crushed and pulverized, or the skull damaged or teeth damaged. So my goal is to teach them what to look for and how to preserve evidence, how to not, you know, mess things up.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's very important, because a lot of times uh, a small piece of evidence that is missed could be the key to um, solving or putting together the full facts of what actually happened. And so I guess there's a procedure, right, that you all use in recovery of bone fragments or any other body parts that could have been involved in a fire.
Yes, absolutely. So the main or the best type of evidence preservation is going to be forensic photography, documenting everything with the camera. Um, you know, Photographing the scene, photographing the body and whatnot. And so there's the photography, and then I also teach how to map and grid a fire scene. So, and that's to accurately document where things come from. The head's here, the feet are here. Are they, is the body intact, or has it been stirred up and jumbled up? Um, and so the grids are a way to scientifically document where each piece of evidence came from. So that way, when the case goes to court, if it goes to court, the jury gets the facts and they get the most accurate representation of that evidence. So we have mapping, we have photography, of course, note taking and whatnot. But I try to really stress, taking your time, treating the body as evidence. Unfortunately, a lot of times the body is yanked from the fire scene and thrown on the front lawn with a sheet over it. And so the body's taken out of its original context. And the body has fire patterns. And so to throw out that piece of evidence, which the body is forensic evidence at that point, they're no longer coming back. So I try to teach proper ways to preserve the evidence, to not touch the body until all the other fire debris has been screened. So it needs to be sifted, it needs to be screened, working all around the body. Normally with crime scenes, you start at the body and you work outward looking for evidence. But with burn bodies, it's the opposite. You work around the body and then slowly in towards the body. That way you're collecting all the debris. You know that you're not destroying evidence. And so those are some of the major things that I try to teach and show them how to do it. Or if it's a live burn demonstration, I'll have the students, lay out a grid. And basically a grid is four-sided quadrants. And a grid can be 4 quadrants. It can be, 20 quadrants. It's all
Right.
depending on the size of the scene and whatnot. But basically to demonstrate and show how to systematically process evidence. And it's important to get dirty. You have to screen through the evidence. You have to screen through all the fire debris. If you just run in and snatch the body, you're leaving parts of that victim behind at the scene.
Right.
And then later
Yeah.
on, the family comes to salvage their belongings, and they find like a foot, or they find, body parts of their loved ones. That's very traumatic. And, it
Right.
reflects poorly on the agency that did the investigation. So my goal is to educate them up front and show them how to properly do it. So that way those mistakes are avoided. And so that's one of the main portions of my training, is how to, properly document a scene with photography as well as mapping, which is an important part, and how to preserve evidence of the body. And that way you get maximum recovery, which in this case, with the 43 students, they didn't get everything. There was still burned bone fragments left at the fire scene, the darker fragments that became camouflaged in the charred wood and charred debris. It just didn't look like part of the body, and it wasn't bright white like the calcined bone, which is more identifiable amongst fire debris, to where they could collect that and take it to a secondary location.
Right. And I do remember looking at some of the photographs from the reports, and they did set up a grid. I'm sure you saw that.
They did,
But
yes.
um, but there was no actual. I mean, if you look at the photographs, it was a pretty big circle, or circular area, darkened area, where potentially not only on the surface of that ground, but you could have had some underneath
Yes,
that
stratified.
surface as well. Right, stratified,
Yes,
exactly. And
yes.
so going back to some of the things that you just mentioned, that's one of the things that we teach our fire investigators. And we just had a very huge fire where we did a grid, and we collected all we sifted through all the evidence that was there. We sifted with our hands everything that was there. And then we collected that debris, brought it back to our lab, and we put it through our sifters. And it's crazy how much evidence we missed. So that's another really good, important point.
Yep.
You may be out there and you may be using your hands on your knees and checking all that for evidence. You're still going to miss some. It's like you said, it's going to be camouflaged and you're going to miss it. And so the best practice always is bring it back, put it in the lab, or put it in a place where you have good lighting and you can actually sift through that material and recover all the evidence that's there. And we've got bags and bags of evidence that we recovered, and it's amazing. All this debris had been processed at the site. So very good point. And I think that's certainly something that we need to consider, or at least the people that are doing the work should consider always, is making sure that they get all the evidence.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because
Hey,
again, you
so
want to
listen,
return to the loved ones. Sorry.
yeah, exactly. I remember one explosion case that I worked in Texas where we came in after the law enforcement and fire had already done their scene processing. And I was working for a private firm at that point, and we came across bone fragments in this scene. So we had to stop, call the sheriff's office, and to let them know, hey, you need to come get this stuff. There's y'all missed some stuff, and it happens. I mean, as part of the everyday occurrences that it happens to us. It happens to everybody, So the best practice is always try to do as best as you can, thorough job to recover all that evidence.
Yeah. And part of the problem is knowing what survives. There's this kind of misconception or myth that the body can be consumed in the fire. So if you assume that the arms and legs are consumed in the fire, you're not going to look for them. So there's that we're up against too, is kind of perception of what's going to survive, what I need to look for, what I don't need to look for if I assume that it's all consumed. And again, that's why training is important, to show people exactly how to do it. I mean, I've talked to fire investigators after my course and they're like, I've missed body parts. I've done it wrong, or whatever. And this opens their eyes. They're like, okay, I know how to proceed going forward. I know how to do my job better. So it kind of gives them a fuller toolkit of how they can improve their careers and their investigations, which again feeds back into closure for the families, closure for the community. And so education is very important, education and training. And that I'm a huge advocate of that and that's why I do all these trainings. I want to share this knowledge. I want to share this information. So that way it improves other people's jobs. And like I said, they're the ones on the front line. They're doing the work. They're doing the investigation. They are the ones providing those answers to family members in the community about that why that person burned, or the burned body, and the investigation.
Yeah, and you've been to a lot of places, right? I think you were in Guatemala, right?
Yes.
Chapter
I see you're going to
chapter
be there
79.
this year.
Yes, yes,
Oh, I
yes.
love Guatemala. Oh, well,
Well, this year's
I
gonna be in
studied down
Panama.
there in college.
Yeah.
Oh, it's,
Oh, yeah. It's a
yeah,
great,
yeah. I
great
went down
country.
to Yeah, I went down to Antigua for about 3 weeks, stayed with a host family, took Spanish 8 hours a day, and of course traveled around, and I fell in love with the place. It was a great reunion getting to go back to Guatemala City.
Good. So, how's your Spanish? Más o
Terrible.
menos.
I can speak at the level of a 3-year-old. But it's luckily there's Google Translator and whatnot, so I'm not totally stranded when it comes to trying to communicate to people who can actually speak Spanish, whereas I'm not very good at it.
Again, you know, I appreciate you coming on. I know that you've done a lot of other podcasts where you've talked at length about some of the things and processes uh, and the trainings that you're doing. And I think it's a great, you're an asset for the fire investigation community. I think everywhere you go, everybody recognizes or loves to see the boots and the socks that you have.
Yes, it's trademark.
That's your signature. Yeah, trademark,
Yes.
exactly. So we look forward to seeing you again. I don't know. Are you going to be going to any of the conferences in the near future?
Yeah,
ITC,
I'll
the
be going
IAAI.
to the ITC. Yes, yes. So the ITC, International Association of Arson Investigators, International Training Conference. And then I go around and lecture to state chapters. So next week I'll be at the Colorado State chapter of the IAAI. The following month I'll be in Oregon for their chapter meeting. Then Massachusetts IAAI chapter, and a few others. So this is where I get to meet all the investigators who are boots on the ground. They're the ones doing the work. And so it's really good. I enjoy sharing all this information, over 20 years worth of burning human cadavers, things I've learned, the good and the bad in terms of proper ways to do it, mistakes that can be made. And I really enjoy sharing this with other people. That way they don't feel overwhelmed. And that's a big part of with burned bodies is you're just kind of overwhelmed. You look at a disfigured body and say, I can't make heads or tails of this. And,
Yeah.
through the training, they're like, oh, okay, well, this isn't rocket science. This is really simple. And I try to put it in simple terms so that everybody gets it. I don't want anybody to be left behind or lost or anything like that in my lectures.
Yeah.
So at best, I hope they're just entertained.
Yep. You're the bone collector.
Definitely.
Well, again, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you soon. And you know, again, if there's anything that you could give as far as advice to investigators out there, what do you say?
Get dirty. Get in there on your hands and knees, sift through the fire debris, look for evidence, take your time, because evidence is going to be there, whether it's parts of the body or it may be other types of evidence. You don't want to leave that at the scene because you only get one shot at processing a scene. And if body parts are damaged or pulverized or overlooked or left behind, that's evidence lost. And
Yeah,
that's problematic. It shouldn't happen. With every other type of death investigation, it's tight, it's very to the T, um, you know, very strategically done. But for whatever reason, with burn bodies, there's a lot of mistakes that happen. And so, like I said, that's my mission is to show them what survives, what they can find, and what it means for their investigation.
well, I appreciate it. I think everybody that has ever heard you appreciates everything you do. And again, thank you for coming on Fuego. This is the voice of fire investigations in Latin America, and you're always welcome back to give us another or more of your input. All right,
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.